very good afternoon to all of you, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this Thought Leadership Lecture Series, which we are running around the world. This is the third of the series. It's been a great delight to have two long-term friends rather than old friends. Somebody did say once to me that I'm not old. Pascal and Subocha, who've been through our anniversary events in the past as well, and I think Pascal was probably the longest anniversary speaker. He was in Delhi on our 20th anniversary and 25th anniversary. Subocha was there for our 25th anniversary. And these were big events that we had organized in the past, but we thought that it might make more sense to do this through a series of lectures around the world where we have been working, or where we, or where we have good friends. And there is a web page on our lecture series which will tell you as to where else these lectures are going to be held. And I'm more than pleased, or equally pleased, to have Fred Jenny, a mentor, guide, and philosopher. Since as many years, he's also been with us on many of these events. Now, very briefly, there will be a 10-minute film, so I would like to begin with welcoming you all again, and to show you the film which will substitute about what I'm going to say. So rather than to give a long speech, here it goes.
Democracy without economic freedom means little to the masses. It can best be promoted through a rights-based approach. This is the core philosophy of consumer unity and trust society. Cuts began in 1983 with a unique war newspaper, Gram Gadda, which means Village Revolution. It was an attempt to fill the information gap with a focus on the rural poor of Rajasthan. The plight of the poor in accessing basic necessities like food, medicines, and power was the driving force behind the establishment of Guts. Work was started out at a motor garage with a zero budget. In those days of socialism, the quality of most goods and services was poor and was accompanied by shortages. For instance, the number of matchsticks per box was much less than the declared quantity of 50. Matchsticks being a mass commodity like salt, consumers would feel the impact of being fleeced of several million rupees annually. This scenario improved after Cuts took legal action. Using the law to assert consumer rights is often more effective than advocacy. Cuts' public interest litigation on female sterilization victims is an example. It led to a change in the government's policy of targeting women as numbers, helping persuade the government to pass the Consumer Protection Act in India was one of Cuts' most successful efforts of the early 80s. This led to the realization that promoting economic democracy is a vital part of political democracy. It also brought about the realization that business has to behave with consumers, and that the state has to ensure balance between the consumers and the producers' interests. In 1990, Cuts campaigned for the poor, and with the blessings of Mother Teresa, marked 1st November as World Poverty Day. Soon after, the UN adopted October 17th as the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. It was around the same time that developing countries like India adopted liberalization and deregulation. Unlike many NGOs, CUTS supported the reforms, but understood that effective regulatory regimes were needed. It then adopted a second motto: liberalization, yes, but with safety nets. The first being value for people. The leaders at CUTS realized that consumer protection could not be limited to just resolving complaints. A forum was needed to seek advice and help. CUTS then spawned a number of small consumer groups. Jagdish Bhagwati, noted trade economist. CUTS has developed from a modest NGO addressing mainly domestic issues to a preeminent position as an international NGO, dealing with issues relating to the world's trading system and related issues. CUTS also created 5 program centers in India to deal with cognate subjects of international trade, competition and regulation, consumer protection, consumer safety, and human development. Furthering the cause of the right to trade, particularly of poor countries, CUTS is advocating for a Geneva consensus on the international level for fair trade, good governance, and capacity building. Surendra Kanstiya, former chairman, Consumer Guidance Society of India, Mumbai. CUTS gave me the wisdom, whereas other organizations gave me knowledge and training. As its work on trade policy increased, CUTS Secretary General Pradeep Mehta was twice appointed as advisor by 2 WTO Director Generals, Subhachai Panitpakdi in 2003 and Pascal Lamy in 2012. He also served as advisor to the Government of India on trade policy matters from 1996 to 2005. To ensure that the fruits of liberalization reached everyone, CUTS worked for competition law and regulatory policies in India and 30 other countries in Asia and Africa. The multi-country 7-Up model was the most popular in this regard. A critical point of difference with similar projects was CUTS' approach, which was bottom-up. Gareth Thomas, former Minister of State, DFID, UK. We value the productive relationship that CUTS and Department for International Development, DFID, had built up in recent years on this agenda. An emphasis on creating local ownership and capacities was followed by comparisons with other countries. Post this, many southern governments appointed CUTS as their advisors. CUTS was also responsible for the adoption and refinement of competition law in many countries, particularly India. Besides trade and regulation, CUTS' spectrum of work includes governance. Its 20th anniversary celebrations followed the theme Governance and its relationship with poverty reduction. We celebrated our 25th anniversary in the year 2000 with a conference on global partnership for development. The focus was on the Millennium Development Goal 8, which talks about global partnership for development. The Millennium Development Goals are an international challenge taken up by the international community to halve poverty by the year 2015. And in that, an enabling environment is to create a better economic environment to be able to add to the growth which is necessary to create the wherewithal to reduce poverty. While we have been working internationally as well as nationally on very large number of issues. One of the understanding that we had, and this is something that we've been doing for a long time, is to intensify our work at the grassroots. In southern Rajasthan, for example, we had taken up promotion of livelihoods for women, and they're organizing about 1,000 self-help groups covering over 100,000 women. In the future, how we visualize, having completed 30 years now, we realize that we will continue to consolidate our work as well as make it more effective, and I would say cost effective as well. And that is how I visualize the journey for Kutch for the next 20 years. Our values: adhering to high standards of accountability and transparency, adoption of a centrist approach, ensuring outcomes rather than just outputs, focus on subject and geographical areas where a vacuum and need exist, enhancing capacity of various stakeholders across Asia and Africa through an inclusive approach.
Thank you, thank you very much. Now, without further ado, I hand over the proceedings to Fred.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here, talk about issues in trade and competition and globalization. We have two very eminent speakers, well known to all of you, so I will not introduce them. I will just make a few notes derived from my own experience that we may have in the background of the speeches. First one, of course, is the incredible, amazing development of trade, international trade over the last 30 years, together with some very significant development in terms of growth, in terms of reduction of poverty. Of course, as trade grew and as market became more and more international, the issue of the private restraints to trade came to the fore. There's been, on the competition front, over the last, I would say, 20 years, an unprecedented increase, proliferation, I would say, of competition law. Great movements of liberalization in great many countries, deregulation, and later on regulatory reform, and finally a great push towards convergence of systems. Those two movements, in my mind, are linked because a lot of the development that we've seen in competition policy was in fact trade-driven in the context of bilateral or regional trade agreements. There was a desire to not only eliminate governmental barriers to trade, but also private barriers to trade, and therefore competition policy reform was often one of the elements of those trade agreements. Finally, I think both in trade and in the area of competition, there's been the realization that neither one of those two policies was sufficient in itself, and both in the trade world and in the competition world, there's been a great concern with linking the trade policy or linking the competition policy with many other policies that are complementary or enabling. So there's this movement towards diffusion or increase in the scope of vision, very clear in the WTO, and I think equally clear in the works of competition authorities. And it's been a movement from competition law enforcement towards competition policy, which has been quite significant. Civil society, and in particular cuts, has taken an extremely active part in this and been associated with cuts for a great many years. But this is one of the reasons why I find this organization particularly commendable for its work both in India and abroad. The agenda of cuts has included all of the topics that I've mentioned: deregulation, competition policy, competition law enforcement, trade policy, international poverty, human development. So one can see the nexus of, the combination of interest, and has been a great promoter and a great advocate, I would say, of changes to make people, nations understand what the issues were. Of course, more recently, because of the financial crisis, new questions have arisen, both on the trade policy side and on the competition policy side. On the trade side, there's been the question of whether protectionism was coming back and how one could prevent this from happening and some of the gains of the past from being dissipated. On the competition policy side, there were questions about the relevance of competition law and competition policy, about how you could have significant market failures, even though you had competition law and policy, and this led to questions about the underlying hypothesis, I would say, of competition law, and how it could be adapted to better, maybe to achieve a better balance between regulation and competition. So I'm just offering those very few thoughts, which are my personal thoughts. Maybe we'll come back to some of these points, and let's go to the main item today, which is to hear both Pascal Lamy and Dr. Supachari, and I turn the floor over to Pascal Lamy.
Thanks very much, Frédéric, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this series of lectures on the 30th anniversary of the Consumer Unity Trusts, which is what cuts mean, even if we talk about cuts without always remembering that it's Consumer Unity Trust. And you've saddled me with a topic which Frédéric has already touched on, which is 30 years that have changed the world of trade. So a good occasion to look back on how this world of trade has evolved over the last 3 decades. I think my starting point is to look back at the 30 years which have been Pradeep's achievement. This is sort of a timeline which allows for a serious appreciation of what has been done and not done. And I must say that looking at what Cuts has been doing for all these years is a clear example of a formidable achievement where he has, in a way, single-handedly transformed Cuts from a modest organization, providing an umbrella to a few small consumer groups in rural Rajasthan, to a truly global institution respected by governments and civil society alike. And as we've seen in the film, Cuts made its entrance into the local scene in 1983 through a wall newspaper, Gram Gadar, which my Indian translators tell me means village revolution. And Pradeep has put it into the global scene. Cuts has changed a lot over the 30 years, and so too has the geopolitical landscape. We've seen the rise of emerging countries and a shift in balance of economic and hence political power. These changes have also reflected in how global trade has matured in this period. In the early 80s, face of trade was completely different. For one, the WTO did not even exist. The GATT was often dismissed as an exclusive members-only club. So perhaps the most important change that I will begin with is this much more universal nature of the WTO membership we have today. There has been an explanation an exponential change from the 89 GATT contracting parties in 1983 to 159 members of the WTO today, the vast majority of which are now developing countries, plus 24 countries at various stages in the process of accession, with at least Yemen, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kazakhstan, and Seychelles in a very advanced stage. These accessions, by the way, need to be fast-tracked in earnest because their pending conclusion remains the sort of last frontier we need to cross to the WTO becoming a truly universal institution. Now, what's the next big change that comes to mind when looking back over these last 30 years? Probably that trade today is less about whole products, whether goods or services, and more about trade in tasks along value chains, which often span not just across countries, but also continents, which is, as you know, one of the thread lines of this Global Aid for Trade Review number 4, and it's therefore no surprise that the breadth and scope of what the WTO rules now cover has significantly expanded as compared to 30 years ago. Of course, looking at numbers, pretty impressive. In the early 80s, trade in goods measured in volumes accounted for roughly $2 trillion US dollars. Last year, 18 trillion US dollars, which means that during this period, merchandise trade, again measured in volume, increased by an average of around 8%, which is, as we all know, much higher than the average rate of growth of the world economy. In the early 80s, while services were known to be important in their own right, we did not have a multilateral agreement covering this sector. Similarly, today, we practically take for granted the obvious role that intellectual property rights play in boosting innovation, in driving manufacturing and industrial growth, and we often lose sight of the fact that 30 years ago there were nothing like a serious multilaterally agreed rule in this area. In addition, while there were some very elementary rules on agricultural trade, we certainly had not started to think it possible to discipline agriculture in the same way as manufacturers. And definitely not in the way envisaged in the draft texts, which are on the table in the Doha round. So I could go on and on, looking at issues like government procurement, information technology, electronic commerce, technology transfer, trade finance, environment, trade facilitation, all topics which have since permeated the fabric of a global trade discussion. At the same time, we've also mainstreamed discussions on issues like sustainable development and aid for trade in our work, something which would not have necessarily been seen as under the trade rubric 30 years ago. So if I had a crystal ball, I could look into the next 30 years, and what I probably would see is that this would make even these changes look mild. But given that these are my few last weeks here, I'll better keep my view on the issues of the future until my final General Council at the end of this month. Launching of an ambitious trade round in Doha with close to 24 topics for negotiations and work, and more importantly, with a strong and central focus on development, is probably another milestone in the history of the multilateral system, although, as we all know, it still remains open whether or not this agenda and when will be closed. But placing development at the core of the Doha negotiations, and this will not change in whatever future negotiating activity, means two things. First, a clear acknowledgement that more open trade can work for development, and we all know that among the controversies of the 80s and 90s, there was a question whether open trade did work for development. And the last 30 years have provided a crystal clear answer to that. Yes, more open trade can work for development, can. But they've also, I think, shown, and this takes us very near to the very purpose of COTS, that in order for this can work to translate into does work, trade opening must be accompanied by a number of other policies, starting with trade capacity, back to aid for trade. And now, of course, this is, I think, part of what we've learned, and which is now an essential element of the trade opening doctrine as per the experience of the last 30 years. Now, while the bulk of successive GATT rounds brought industrial tariffs down, but for tariff peaks, and there remain quite a number of that, what Doha tried to do was to address other relevant barriers to trade today, some in the frame of non-tariff barriers, some in border red tape, some in deepening the opening of trade services. It also offered opportunities to ensure that trade is more supportive of sustainable development by tackling, for instance, fisheries subsidies, or opening up trade in environmentally friendly goods and services. All of these, by the way, having in the meantime become extremely relevant for the proper functioning of value chains. Another, I think, major feature looking back is, of course, the WTO dispute settlement system. I think there is no real comparator in terms of time efficiency, quality of judgment delivered anywhere in the international system. There is also no comparator in terms of depth of member ownership in the findings of WTO panels and the appellate body reports, and yet in 1983, the GATT still operated on the lean provisions of GATT Article 22 and 23, a system whose very design locked it intentionally into an inherent weak operational structure. I don't think, to be frank, that the founders of WTO could have envisaged the remarkable contribution it has made to global economic stability. Of course, the GATT had laid the foundation for global cooperation on international trade regulation. It had made its contribution, which I think is remarkable at the time, to maintaining world peace. But this young organization, after all, WTO is only 18 years old, has not only contributed to global peace and security by strengthening the reliance of nations on one another for trade, But in the last years, and notably since the beginning of the crisis, through its periodic transparency and monitoring exercise, it has also prevented nations from adopting wide-scale protectionist measures. Again, not that a little bit of that hasn't happened here and there, but globally speaking, the test of a worldwide insurance policy against protectionism has so far been successfully addressed. Finally, I think one main feature is also in a huge change in the negotiating dynamics that have come out during this period. In today's WTO, it's unimaginable that an agreement amongst the Quad of the 80s would anywhere be seen as sufficient to conclude a deal. So while I no doubt share the global optimism at the evolution of a sort of a more balanced power equation within the WTO, perhaps on a personal level and looking at these few years of experience in whether in Brussels or in Geneva, I think one of the most remarkable changes, which is not very much in the public sphere, but which practitioners cannot have missed, is the remarkable change in the negotiating prowess of the LDC group. 30 years ago, it was totally inconceivable that LDCs would be a force to reckon with in multilateral trade negotiations. Now, today, LDCs have a common, well-researched position that have helped to place their agenda at the fore of multilateral negotiations. So, in some clearly radical transformations, what was once a members-only club has opened its door to all, not least the NGOs, and perhaps, and that's my concluding point, there are parallels between the evolution of COTS and the growth of the WTO. The quest to develop truly global organizations that are open to organic growth, reflecting the ever-changing needs of the global economy in which we operate. And as I wind up my term in the office here at the WTO, I believe there's an even important role that organizations like COTS and other civil society organizations can play in keeping the multilateral system accountable to the development challenge, which in many ways has been my philosophy and the core of my efforts as a DG of this organization. So, Pradeep, I think you will keep pulling the cart in this direction, and whatever I will be, I will remain an ardent supporter of such initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much for very insightful comments. I mean, I'm sure that there will be questions. We will have time after the two speeches for questions and comments from the audience. But before, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Supachai to talk about trade, competition, consumer policy.
Thank you very much, Frederick. And before I proceed, certainly would like to just echo what my good friend Pascal has just been saying about cuts and contributions of cuts to the multilateral trading system. Not in a way that we can easily see clearly ahead of us in terms of, let's say, negotiations or market access opening up, but in terms of letting the results of our work at the World Trade Organization in terms of opening up markets, setting up good rules, that those rules and market openings could be used in a fair manner, in a way that we can guarantee the results of the process of freeing up trade, so that consumers would really have the choices. They would have the quality, the standard of the products, and would certainly guarantee the way that they are not going to be abused. And of course, the market powers will not be abused, because by liberalizing the market powers, you certainly cannot really have a prejudgment as what sort of results finally would be produced. So we at the UN, at UNCTAD, greatly appreciate this work that Prateep and his team at CUTS have been contributing, and the work that we've been doing together in the areas of competition, consumer protection policies, investment agreements. All these are areas in which we are trying to move so that we can support trade liberalization in a way capacity can be built, and also the kind of fairness could be guaranteed for the consumers at large. CUT is celebrating its 30th anniversary. Next year, UNCTAD will be celebrating our 50th anniversary. It's a long time for UNCTAD to be around, 50 years, and in the last 8 years on my watch, we've always been working very closely with CUT, and surprisingly to see that in certainly 3 of the 4 areas of the so-called Singapore issues that has been intensively debated before it was decided to pick one up, the 3 of the 4 areas have been covered by the activities at UNCTAD. And actually, under my watch, I would like to see that, hope that it result in more intensive work in these 3 areas. You might be surprised how so. But if you look at the areas of investment, competition, and trade facilitation, we have fairly well covered all these 3 areas, mostly jointly with the WTO, particularly in terms of our negotiation, in terms of negotiations with the WTO that we have been advising, supporting. But to see the evolution of the thought processes in the last 30 years is something which is, I think, a lesson to be learned. Now, 30 years ago in the 1990s, you will probably recall that in those days, we were witnessing a series of mega deals, mega mergers in the areas of Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, General Electric, Honeywell, and also Microsoft. And in those days, we were concerned because competition agencies around the world had difficulty. Those that existed in those days were having different interpretation of how to deal with these mega mergers. At the same time, in those days, we were seeing Europe move into a sort of a single market entity. And the one I would say combining theme of that single market single market entity is the existence of the theme on competition, on competition and competition rules. So a lot of people around the GATT and the WTO in those days were thinking that if some of these rules on competition and competition policies could have some implications, particularly if some implication on market access, that sometimes market access could be impacted because there might be dominant powers in the market that could move the market around. There could be some powers that would limit participation in the market or single out parts of the market to be passed around for different companies or group of companies to be predominating over those market size. So quite a number of people were thinking, I think justifiably along that line, whether when you have trade liberalization, more market access, whether we would need flanking measures along the line of protection of consumer interests, and at the same time to make sure that the gains that we have reaped through liberalization will not be negated because people go over into the anti-competitive policies area. And of course, some of us were thinking by looking at the practices of the GATT and WTO in different areas that there were already some implications coming out of the way the WTO functions. If you look at the so-called anti-dumping, the trade remedial policy. Now, anti-dumping is about how to counter the kind of unfair practices that would have the sort of below cost prices that would actually distort the market and help to corner the market in one ways and try to exploit the market later on. And so this kind of predatory practices have already been recognized in the way anti-dumping practices have been put into implementation. If you look at the TRIPS agreement, the TRIPS agreement actually allows the kind of the patent obligations that could be validated by governments, giving actually some sort of an anti-competitive practices. Yes, because it gives something like proprietorship to only those who have actually owned the IP. But of course, with a kind of fervent wish that this will lead to more innovation and more benefits for investment and trade in the future. So it's already there, the sense of having this IP and also some of the anti-competitive practices. This actually restrict contestability in the market. But of course, with this kind of logic that those restrictions could promote larger degree of innovation. We have seen in the GATT agreement, Article 8, that there is a sort of provision that talks about, if I recall, talks about that the supplier should not resort to monopolistic policies to limit the entry of or to violate the national treatment, something like that, in the GATT agreement already exists. So that was something like 30 years ago, and there were those proponents of including competition into the way we should be working with negotiations for more market access and for rules making exercise. Now, on the other hand, there was also legitimacy in the way that some of us have been thinking and saying, look, I mean, of course, we might need competition policy, but won't this kind of policy restrict us in the way that we would have the need to have policy space to adopt certain, again, anti-competitive policies, for example, in the areas of infant industry agreement, or in the areas of industrial policy that is now making a return at the moment. But in those days, in the 1990s, a lot of countries in Asia, for example, the new tigers and the young tigers, they were all using industrial policies with a little bit of the anti-competitive policies in the background to promote some of this policy space. There were others who were saying in those days, I recall, that you cannot work on this one-size-fits-all kind of an agreement. If you look at investment, for example, you cannot have a uniform investment agreements, and the effort that you have seen that the OECD, the multilateral agreement on investment, the MAI, has been actually shut down. And so, I mean, you cannot think of doing this with competition because countries have different backgrounds, different sizes of company in different countries. In some countries, one huge company may not actually imply this dominant power, but in some other economies, just smaller size, and those companies, they can imply certain dominant power as well. So there were legitimate objections to the one-size-fits-all kind of agreement, and that would not actually be something that we all can accept as a general rules here. And of course, there were some economists who were saying in those days that you shouldn't spend too much time on this kind of rule-making exercise. There are much more urgent policies to be carried out in terms of doing marketing reform. Particularly in those days, markets reform would prescribe the way that government will have to be able to segregate themselves, because pre-1990s, governments have been so much involved in all kind of exercises that have become so much a sort of interventionist policy making. So in those days, economists were saying, look, I mean, you don't need to go all the way to be looking at bid rigging or cartel, whatever kind of conducive actions, but just look at the way governments are driving policies forward. So there has been all sorts of arguments in favor and against taking up competition rules at the multilateral level. But if you now looked at the way the thought process, as Frederick has been already saying, the way that there's now a proliferation of the way competition rules are being adopted throughout the world. In the 1990s, there were less than 50 countries that know about setting up the competition rules. Less than 50 countries. And during our negotiations in the first WTO meeting in Singapore in, I think, 1995, there were countries that just rejected outright because they didn't know anything about it, and so why should we be bothering ourselves by adopting all these agreements on competition rules? And lo and behold, now in last year, 2012, I just checked the figure before I came here. There were in last year 122 countries having this competition rules in use. Well, in use meaning I have to be frank about it. There's quite a number of countries that have rules, but never know how to implement it. This is another problem that we would have to sort out in the future. But this is a change and an evolution of thought processes that I would like us all to understand and to appreciate how CUTS has been working and how UNCTAD has been working with CUTS to maintain the interest in some of the areas that could not have been subject to some of the intricate negotiations, protracted negotiations, leading to so many rulemaking that would be just prescribing one size fits all. That would not probably fly. But anyway, that there would be ways that we could apply some of these rules elsewhere, having people looking at the principles and joining hands from time to time, as we do nearly every year with our intergovernmental expert group, looking on the way we harmonize competition rules and consumer welfare protection policies and things like that. So I wouldn't say that we should pat our own backs and congratulate us, CUT and UNCTAD, that we've seen to it that from 50 to 122 is quite a record. But anyway, this is still growing. The list is still growing, and we're still having countries that have come to see us to talk about how to set up those rules and regulations. And it's also very pleasing to see that countries in transition, particularly countries in transitions that, of course, in the old days that was preceding the convergence of the system. Now that countries in transitions have emerged as market-oriented economies, they are finding much more to their benefits to be having the market, the liberal market system, but at the same time to be accompanying this market liberalization processes with some form of competition authorities. And just today and this afternoon, and I think Frederick, you're going to chair the session on the policy review that we have conducted for Ukraine. And you'll be surprised to see that Ukraine has already had a long time, I think this was more than 20 years that they have had, but to practice it now, they are now modernizing, revising with us, with our recommendations, and to see that the powers that are invested into their competition authorities are quite significant. Much stronger than I have seen in other areas, in areas of economics that are more liberal, more market-oriented than is these economies. And many of these countries in transition are just really looking forward to dealing with their own economy, which is infested with a sizable, what they call shadow economy. In some of the economy in transition, shadow economy is more than 50%. So this is the way that things have evolved, and if I just take a couple more minutes to point out some of the facts that as we are working on this sort of issue, we are seeing the rise of the transnational corporations. The rise of the transnational corporation, and now that we are talking also about global value chain, 90% of the total trade that TNCs are involved in terms of linking in international network of production. This 80%, sorry, 80% of the global trading volume are trade involved with the GVC operationalized by the TNCs. And the TNCs, they all do this by making investment, setting up shops here and there, and everybody. This is a part of the chain that we are seeing. But at the same time, by making this investment and having sizable TNC participating in the international trade, countries around the world are seeing, look, here we are seeing some forms of maybe anti-competitive infringement because of the size of the TNCs and the way they sometimes group together to work in some markets. Sometimes they group together to limit the buying power, to make smaller economies be more dependent on limited group of buyers so that they can control the market. Sometimes they use the powers to limit the competition from the domestic companies. We've seen in Africa in the last 10, 20 years the process of deindustrialization. And of course, some of us think that it's because of the invasion of the foreign investors, the sizable investors, or whatever. But people are seeing that there is a crowding out effect of some of the domestic investment because of the foreign investment. So there are all kinds of concerns, and if you look at the way the poor will be affected, SMEs are not always granted easy access because the access is always controlled by the proprietor of the chain. You would see that the way the poor are not always afforded the best prices because some collusive efforts cartel effort results in unjustifiably high prices being charged for some of the essential products. If you go for food or pharmaceutical product, medicines, and all these essential products, you would question sometimes why the price is so high. And it's not because of the fundamental change in supply and demand all the time. So that would be practices that would seem to be emerging that we need to take care of, that not by just more market access negotiations alone, but we need to take care that the rules-making exercise that probably will be the future of the way we look at multilateral trading system, that we strengthen all these rules. But we have to strengthen all these rules with the understanding that we're not bringing back some of the regulations. So these are some of the things that come to my mind and some of the words that I would like to leave with you. The first thing is that when you look at the need to promote competition, and when you have the rules and regulations that are being set up, there are competition rules and there are economic rules, economic regulations, because economic policy making, access to market, and how licenses are granted, they're not always left in the hand of competition policies. Governments always have to step in. They would have to have their own economic management policies. And so most of the time, in order to be looking at, let's say, countries are now very worried about this ecological changes. So many times you would see government stepping into different areas like investment policies, economic policies in general. Governments become assertive because to be able to evoke green economy things, they would have to put in more rules and regulations. And whether these rules and regulations would be competitively implemented or they would limit competition, most of the time they have restrictive kind of effects on competition. So here we have to be able to take care that while we are becoming more enthusiastic about looking at the rules and regulations to maintain the health care, the food safetiness and all this other thing, we have to make sure that they are not really provoking the kind of anti-competitive policies at the same time. So there must be some balance between economic regulation, enabling state, as we call it, UNCTAD, and also the need to enhance competition. The second area which we are seeing very frequently these days is the so-called sector policies are emerging. Sector policies on electricity, on water, on IT, on transportation, on carbon dioxide emission, all these other things. There will be sector policies. And all these sector policy will be regulatory bodies for all the sectors policy. In energy, you have regulatory body on energy. When you privatize energy, you have the independent energy producers and things like that. So at the same time, you have the sector policies, sectoral regulatory bodies, and at the same time, you have these national competition policies. And they are not always in agreement because jurisdictions of the sector policies, jurisdictions, and also competition jurisdiction, they're not always in harmony. So in many cases, you see a lot of conflicts in some countries. In some countries, for example, banking is very simple. Central bank is a sector policy. They control the number of banks, the policies, interest rate. But do they always look at the way the bank's clients, the consumers of the banking services, are they well protected? Not always. Sometimes they're in the hands of the competition policies, and they don't always have the same policies as to how banking competition could be enhanced. Just one yes, okay. Then last point. One last point. We are seeing more and more the kind of cross-border anti-competitive actions. A lot of cross-border mergers and acquisitions, and I've already alluded to the fact that the TNCs have been gaining in terms of their size and activities around the world. So there is greater need for national competition policies to be working together. But this is not always the case because national competition committee, they have their rules and regulations, particularly the confidentiality of their information. So it's always a question whether we can really have kind of harmonization. So UNCTAD has been working to try to reconcile all these differences, the way jurisdictions could be joined or informal. If they cannot join formally, then we try to ask them to exchange information and have more meetings together. We can organize them. And now we are trying, as my last point, to make things happen by putting things online. There's now an effort to do what we call collaborative information platform. This is an online data bank wherein this is a virtual forum wherein competition authorities from around the world can latch on to read information, particularly on investigations. Because there are a lot of investigations that are along the same line in the same sectors that they can learn from each other and post it. Sometimes is investigation already been completed, sometimes ongoing, and so they can learn more about the way they can make use of the best information system. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Subuchai. I find that those two speeches were not only highly interesting, but rather uplifting. In some way, Pascal Lamy has told us about the change in the nature of international trade, the transformation of the multilateral system, which has gone along with those changes, the robustness of the institutions, in particular the dispute settlement mechanism, the growing ownership of the multilateral system by all countries. So that is quite a positive assessment of the institution and the development of trade. And Dr. Subuchai has shown how an idea which was probably sound, but maybe presented too early in the context of the Doha round of negotiation, has grown thanks to the efforts of UNCTAD and CUTS and many others, how the complementarity between trade, competition policy, and consumer policy and economic development has become more obvious throughout the recent years, together with the proliferation of competition rules at the national level, and how there's an increased consistency of this policy. So on one hand, an institution which is robust, open, and has wider scope. On the other hand, an idea which has grown, matured, and is much more acceptable now than it was at a few years back, let's say a decade ago. We have about 20 minutes left, and I'm sure that there are comments or questions that, and I can see that Anna Fox has her hand ready. So please make a comment or ask a question, and both Pascal Lamy and Dr. Subuchai will answer.
Yes, thank you very much. That was very stimulating and very thoughtful. Dr. Supachai, you made a very balanced, very provocative remarks. You said that the competition issue from the Singapore issue is fairly well covered. I want to push you on that. And you mentioned also that there's quite a record on thinking about the competition and trade and other world issues, which is clearly right, and those who are in the front of the room have done probably the most for that. I want to make two comments. One, perhaps you reflected on this, but you reflected on trends of development of law. There is one trend that I think you didn't mention, which is that in the interpretation of competition law, there's been in some quarters a very conservative trend and not leaning towards helping the weak, but actually leaning towards the status quo. And there are some competition principles on a horizontal national level that may become international standards. Okay, that was one comment. I wanted to say, perhaps in view of that, but other things you said, my question's going to end up being, do we need more work on an international level? Are there more gaps? You mentioned in connection with the attempts to pursue an international agreement on competition within the WTO, two particular criticisms. One, size doesn't fit all, and second, that the developing countries think they need more policy space. Do you think we need to put the lie to the first one, that this is a straw man, that there was never an attempt for one size to fit all? And do you think we need to do assurance on the second one, that developing countries do have to have policy space, and that's totally consistent with having a world system? Do you think that we should be cataloging the gaps that will never be taken care of on a horizontal level, which ends up being nationalistic? I mean, if we have national only law, it ends up, sometimes it's going to be liberal, sometimes it's going to be protectionist and nationalistic, and the gaps such as, again, those on the podium, Pradeep Mehta and Frederick Genie, have highlighted very well. The export cartels just fall into a gap because countries may allow export cartels that hurt particularly developing countries. So, as I said, I would love you to say a few words on, do we need to, I don't think push is the right moment, but develop more the agenda for where are the gaps that are not being taken care of on the national level with convergence on a national level, and is it possible to ready such an agenda for an appropriate time when maybe those gaps can be filled? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, maybe we're going to take a few questions and then give the floor back to our speakers. I see that there are two requests for the floor. So, Madame.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Mr. Lani, I agree very much with the remarkable increase in the prowess of the LDCs as negotiators, and we can all think of reasons why, but how did it happen? And in particular, how did it happen in the WTO and rather less so in other international organizations? And I'm a little tempted to follow up Mr. Genie's points on Dr. Supachai's presentation to ask, did the Doha round start 10 years too early?
Is another request, and after you. In the back.
Carlos Primo Braga, IMD Avian Group. My question is both to Mr. Lamy and to Dr. Supachai, and follows up on what was just posed. If you were to think in terms of the agenda for the WTO with respect to competition law, should we wait for the completion of the Doha round, or would you be in favor of adding to the new agenda independently of the completion of the Doha round discussions about competition law? And just a question to Dr. Supachai, is competition law really important? Because if we look, for instance, at two areas that are very regulated, like water and telecommunications, and we ask which one we have got better access. And telecommunications, with all its complexities, we have got much better access over the last 20 years than water in the developing world. In both cases, competition is sometimes significantly regulated. I would argue that the big difference is that in the case of telecom, you have prices above marginal costs, and in the case of water, that's not the case, and that's why you don't have investments in infrastructure. So independently of competition law, if you don't have the proper sectoral regulation, you are not going to deliver from the point of view of development. What are your thoughts on this?
Please. I'm KK Sharma from KK Sharma Law Offices, India. I want to take on from the first 10 minutes film which was shown on Kutch and what Professor Eleanor Fox told just now. Export cartel is just one of the visible symptoms where disagreements are obvious. Unfortunately, disagreements and differences are too many to be tolerated. I'll tell you the example of a visiting Spaniard who is working for UNCTAD. She visited India. And after visiting Bombay, she comes to me in Delhi and she says, how do you live in such a country where on the roadside you can see poverty dancing? People are not having drinking water. I told her, you do not know our miseries really. We don't only live with this differences and this deprivation, we also live with the speeches that competition law principles are same, we should not feel differences. We keep on hearing lectures from all developed nations that these principles are same and you cannot have different standards, and don't talk of industrial policy in developing nations like India. What began with cuts? Counting of matchsticks. I do not know in how many developing nations will even think of that. Issues are different. They have got gas lighters. Matchstick is banished in half the time. So we have got issues which are different, which are so different, which have not been acknowledged yet. This export cartel is a visible thing because this is too obvious. There are many, many things because of inequality, because of deprivation, because of lack of development, lack of infrastructure, that these things have not even been recognized. Let's forget about addressing. So my request to both these people on the dais, for all of them is there a way that these things can be given voice and can be addressed? Thank you so much. Very much for those questions. I now turn to Pascal Lamy and Dr. Subachai. They're tough questions.
On the first question, on the difference for LDCs between now and before, which again, as a practitioner, qualified as huge, I think there are two main reasons for that. First, trade is much more important for them than it used to be. Now, we all know LDCs are 1% of world trade, which is a tiny portion, but it's 1% of a pie that has not been multiplied by 10 in size. So it's 10 times more important than it was, even if they still have 1%, and even if a large part of this 1% is in raw material, which in many ways is not the area of international trade that benefits the most from trade opening, because if you have oil or ores, you have to sell them, and if you don't have them, you have to buy them, which limits the sort of advantages of specialization and international division of labor. Now, the second reason is that GATT started and WTO increased permanently capacity building. And this has to do with a large part of what my predecessors did, including Supachai, but Mike Moore also brought his own input in this. We've recently released for our members a set of numbers that show where the WTO Secretariat spends its resources. And the number one area where we spend our resources, in fact, 35% of our resources, is capacity building. So our training activities, Aid for Trade, what we do with the Enhanced Integrated Framework, the International Trade Center, as compared to the 35% of our resources we spend on capacity building, the amount of our secretariat resources we spend on negotiations is less than 5%. So we, in reality, have a sort of permanent training system, university. We now train through e-learning 4,000 people a year in this little tiny organization. So, and that, of course, has resulted in the level of expertise growing. Of course, there are tons of leaks because many of the people we train do not remain in a trade ministry or in a trade authority. Fine with that, by the way, because what they've learned they use elsewhere. So I think that's the second reason. And third, they got organized. If you look at how the LDC group now works, like the African group or the ACP group, you know, they've got a system, they've got focal points that they've split the work among themselves, they've got technicians, they've got regular ambassador meetings, so they got organized. They are a sort of trade union, and that's what works. On competition, if you look at the recommendations of this panel I worked with during 1 year on the future of world trade, what we called at the end the challenges of convergence, and Pradeep was kind enough to be one of the 12 members of this panel. Competition is there as a future topic for WTO negotiations. Now, and that's the view of the panel. Now, if you want my view, there is no media in this room. I do agree that there is a strong connection between the efficiencies you lend to trade opening and the avoidance of these efficiencies being captured by anti-competitive practices. The theoretical case is absolutely obvious. But first, what Supachai said, which is that now 122 countries have competition legislation, does not suffice to make the case that we need international disciplines. We have not, I say we because I'm in favor of that, but we have not yet made clearly the case that you need international disciplines in this field. It's not because it's connected to trade, it's not because it's important, it's not because many countries have competition legislation that you will justify this sort of enormous diplomatic energy you need to deploy to have anything agreed at global level. I can tell you, mobilizing this sort of energy is long haul, and you need a very strong case. Now, this case is not there, in my view, for the moment. Second, in many areas of competition, anti-competitive practices, you will border issues which are weakly disciplines in WTO because they are near to the heart of sovereignty. Energy, export restrictions, export limitations, export taxations. When you look at the issue technically, you're very near to that ground, which means that not only do you have to make the case that it's necessary, but you will have to overcome resistances by some of our members that will believe that if we start poking into this, this is going to be near my own view that I'm sovereign on my resources, and I don't want anybody to tell me that because the world is globalized, I have to sell what's in my soil, and worse than that, at a price which is not the price I want to sell, and worse than that, this has to be transported according to freedom of transit. So, quite a lot of hurdles to jump before we get there. Otherwise, I don't think there's a problem. I mean, we know that the future of trade negotiations will be about whichever way of dovetailing Doha mandated topics and topics which will be mandated, which were not mandated in Doha because they were not a big issue at the time. So we all know that's the pattern now. How, when it will happen, still unclear. Of course, if Bali was to deliver a trade facilitation agreement, that would be the first start of this dovetailing period. If it doesn't, the question mark remains much bigger.
Yes, just 3 points I'd like to make. Just try to bundle. Bundling is not really very competitive kind of exercise, but just to bundle your equations together. The first point that I would like to make is that by saying how much we have seen the evolution of thought processes in the last 30 years, I'm not saying that we're going to bring back the discussion on negotiations on competition rules back to the WTO. I never said that. What I said was that we've done very well in keeping the whole thing alive and going well, and without any mandatory agreement, we are seeing countries jumping on the board and making use of it in a I would say pragmatic way. And so there are a lot who have actually jumped on the board but have not really made use of it. There are countries I know that they have had for decades competition rules, but never make use of it because of the political implications. So what I'm saying is that we are there. I mean, CATS is there, UNCTAD is there, and we are tasked as a focal point by the UN system to be watching over, monitoring the way the competition rules and consumer protections are being adopted by countries. And every 5 years, as you know, every 5 years we have a huge summit where all the practitioners of competition rules will come together and try to exchange view on what you've been doing, you know, it's some improvements and things like that. So this is still work in progress, and we have still to improve. And we understand that still a lot of national authorities are still they're not strong enough to be able to lift, to upgrade their powers to the multilateral level. So, but we are trying to educate them, to make them more effective and to make them more independent. Yesterday, if you would listen to a Pakistani lady who came from one competition authority in Pakistan, she was doing a lot of fight against some of the collusive powers, and she was very, very courageous about it. But the only thing we all need was the independence of all these competition authorities, so that they can be effective in a way they enforcing the rule. The second issue that I would like to clarify is that I want to make sure that you understand the point that I was trying to make, that competition authorities cannot be given all these powers. Of course, there would be sectors. There would be sectors that would have to have their own authority. But what I meant to say was that there should be within the national policy making arena that they would have to reconcile the way powers are being distributed and redistributed among all these agencies, and they may have to work together, and it's the best benefit. I fully realize that in certain specialized technical areas you need really regulatory body that have the technical ability to regulate, whereas competition authorities would have to have only authorities on the competition areas, but they sometimes intertwine. The last point that you were making, sir, on the deprivation and poverty, I don't think we are saying that competition rules will be able to deal with all this poverty issue. We still basically we still need education, we need jobs, we need capacity building. But what we've been trying to say is that the impact of collusive behaviors, of anti-competitive conducts, can have strong implication for the poor, and more so these days. More so these days, because there are larger and larger chains and larger TNCs with more control on the proprietorship of the technology, and the poor people. Consumer protection in this case is really something which is very strongly needed. The choices are there. If you look at the advertisement on the television around you and everything, that the poor are in a very bad position, and they always consume a lot of wrong things in a way that the safety standard is not there, and there are a lot of products that they consume in trust. They just trust it because you never can tell the quality of one pill to another. So in all these areas, you need some form of regulatory system with competition and consumer policies that must be in use to help this. It won't solve the poverty issue, like you said, no, it won't, but at least it would help to alleviate the unfairness that has been actually meted to the poor people. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those answers. Indeed, when I reflect on what Pascal Lamy was saying, it may be that as the case for the interface between competition, consumer policy, and trade policy becomes more obvious, there is somewhere less and less of a need for an international agreement. Because what happens is that the proliferation of competition law, the convergence of competition law, and the formal and informal cooperation on the bilateral or regional or plurilateral basis substitutes, so to speak, or takes care of a great number. And as Dr. Superchai said that in his initial speech, there are fewer conflicts that are obvious that would give an impetus to, and somewhere national sovereignty of when it comes to the competition function is more respected, even though there are still gaps, and the export cartel case is quite, but in terms of making the case that one has to invest heavily to try to bring the international community to, it may be an even more difficult task, even though everybody agrees that the idea is, the idea of the convergence is a good idea. I know that Dr. Superchai has an appointment at 3 o'clock, and therefore that we have to stop our exchange now. I want to thank very much both.
Let me just add one thing on this competition issue. I stick to the view on the difficulty to move to the step of an international agreement, but there is one step that could be done in between, which is a proper transparency reporting on what is done by domestic competition authorities. And that, the normal thing, and Frederick knows that very well, the OECD should do that. By the way, the OECD partly does that, but when it comes to China, India, Brazil, So, if I had one suggestion to make, and whether it's UNCTAD or WTO doesn't really matter, it's a question of logistics, but which would be to have at least a mandate for some place to gather this information, disseminate it. Now, the International Competition Network in some ways can do that, but this is between specialists. It has a huge value because it also helps adjusting here and there. But I think if we want to go public on this, the first step should be transparency. And I don't think Pradeep will be surprised that I advocate for transparency.
One minute. The Superchat has to go.
Pascal, one leg you missed out. The fourth factor in why LDCs have been able to develop their capacity on trade is the active role of the civil society in working with governments and intergovernmental organizations like the World Bank, UNCTAD, etc. Secondly, a lot of us tend to forget that trade policy itself can promote a lot of competition. As I've often said, the WTO is the biggest competition regulator in the world. Let us not ignore that very basic premise of WTO. The third factor is Sheila has gone. Why the Doha round was 10 years earlier. I think if 9/11 would not have happened, then the Doha round may not have happened. There was matchsticks. K.K. Sharma raised a very important question. That is when we started understanding the market. Amartya Sen got his Nobel Prize for his work on Bengal famine in West Bengal and East, now what is called Bangladesh. You'd be surprised, Pascal, that the poor in one of the districts in West Bengal used to buy 5 matchsticks at a time. They could not afford more than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you for being here. Let me give the floor to finish this to Mr. Kokap.
Thank you very much, Chair. In the final 1 minute, it's my pleasure to request my colleagues Sanushari, Josiane, and Simon to bring the mementos here, while I pay the formal thanks on behalf of myself and the Kutz family, all the staff from our headquarters in Jaipur to centers in Delhi, Chittorgarh, Kolkata, Nairobi, Lusaka, Geneva, and very soon Accra. To special thanks to Director General Lamy and Secretary General Supachai for your excellent lectures as well as for your support to Kutz for many years, and which we are confident will continue in the future also. To all of you for being here today, for making this event happen and making it successful. To Pradeep for daring to dream and then working for 30 years, sheer hard work, commitment, passionate work to make Kutz what it is today. And finally, also I must thank our WTO colleagues, particularly Arancha Gonzalez, Shishir Piradarshi, Michael Roberts, and others who helped us a lot in organizing this event. So thank you all, and we look forward to working with you all in the days, years to come to make this world a better place for all. And now I request my colleague Tanushari Bhatnagar to come here and give these